All right, hello to anyone who might be watching this. Thanks for watching. My name is Joy Morin. I'm a piano teacher in Ohio and a blogger at colorinmypiano.com. And the last couple of weeks, we've been having some discussions over Google Hangouts with other piano teachers and just talking about certain topics and having a discussion about that. So we're having another one here today. Our topic today is piano technique. We're going to focus mostly on the beginner piano student. But we might hit on a few things for more intermediate piano students. And I have a couple of teachers here with me today. I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Maybe we could start with Edna, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm a wife and let's see, we got married in what year? 1975. And a mother of 6, and I have 19 grandchildren. And my life turned upside down a year and a few months ago when my husband's best friend, who owned the company worked for, just decided one day he didn't want my husband part of his business anymore, and I've kind of been a gypsy ever since. I had to give up my piano studio. In fact, I gave my baby grand piano to my daughter because I didn't want to put it in storage. So I no longer have a piano. And my husband and I have traveled around as he's been looking for more work. He turned 60 right before this happened, and it's been very difficult for him to find any work. We've been in Missouri visiting children there, and Louisiana, and Washington, and Utah, and I'm here at Minot Air Force Base now visiting another daughter. And Monday I'll go join my husband who has temporary work until December down in Utah. In the meantime, while I've been here at Minot, I've been able to teach some piano students in their homes, get some students started, some who hadn't had lessons before, some who were taking lessons but not enjoying it, and they wanted to give me a try. And being on a military base, it's okay. They don't think long-term anyway, because, you know, at any time they might get a transfer. So I've been able to teach. I've had 7 students right here in this neighborhood on the base, and one of them and maybe 2 more are going to follow me when I leave, because I've been teaching Skype lessons, Skype and Facetime lessons. I've continued teaching some of my students in Nevada, where we lived when my husband lost his job. I had over 30 students there, and I've been able to keep a number of those by Skyping with them. And I'm teaching several of my grandchildren around the country and other students. I've got a student and his son up in Canada. And the biggest challenge for me has been keeping all of the time zones straight, because I'm trying to deal with 4 time zones as I do my scheduling. And sometimes I get confused, but I'm doing okay with that. And I actually have to say that I have never enjoyed teaching as much as I have doing the Skype lessons. It's the interaction with the students is a little bit different. I miss being there face to face, but the kind of teaching I'm able to do as I sit at my computer and I'm able to immediately get some information or find a song for them and send it their way, and I use Microsoft OneNote, and I have files for each one of them on OneNote. So as we're going, I'm typing what I want them to do, and if they have OneNote too, then they just get in and they check all of my notes. If they don't have it, then I zip it to them in a PDF through email, and they've got all of the things they're supposed to be working on during the week. Anyway, that's what I'm doing right now. I've taught since 1971, and I've taught hundreds and hundreds of students because we've moved so many times, and at one point I had over 80 students because there was a shortage of students teachers in that area. And one of the things that I did was to accommodate my schedule and their lack of funds, but wanting to have piano lessons so badly, I would teach teenagers who didn't have a lot of time for practice anyway. I teach them like twice a month, and then I could have other students on the off weeks. Or I would take families of, say, like that had 3 children who, wanted to have lessons, and I just couldn't fit that many more half hours in my schedule. I'd teach 3 of them in 1 hour, and so we'd overlap. I could teach them all some similar things at the same time, or I'd give them each 20 minutes individual lessons. Anyway, I just had to figure out how to do it because there weren't enough teachers. Ever wanted to be said that somebody couldn't learn how to play the piano because they could never find a piano teacher. So
that's great. That's really interesting to hear about your situation, and there's definitely challenges involved with teaching over Skype or FaceTime. But it's in some ways it has improved my teaching, I think, when I've done it here and there. Anyway, we could have a whole session just about that, I think. Alyson, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Alyson, and I'm located in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm the owner of Triads Studios. And I teach 3 things. I teach piano lessons, voice lessons, and harp lessons. This fall, it looks like I'm going to have about 45 students enrolled. And my biggest challenge and enjoyment is trying to teach off the bench and just trying to be a little more creative in our teaching, and especially how to do that while still teaching technique, I think, is really crucial and something that I'm really interested in kind of learning a little bit more about.
All right, thanks, Alyson. Julie, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Julie Knerr. I teach at the Hart Community Division at the Hart School of Music in West Hartford, Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut and then moved away and just moved back last year and bought a house, so sitting in my new piano room. But I teach at the Hart School, not at home, and I teach private lessons, and I just started teaching some group classes. We had a 4-week summer session that just ended yesterday, so that was exciting, a group class session. And then I also am a co-author of the Piano Safari Piano Method, so I work on that too.
All right, that's great. Yeah. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, our topic today is piano technique, particularly for beginner students. If anyone watching has questions, I see like right now we've got 3 viewers on YouTube. If anyone, while you're watching, if you have questions you'd like us to answer, there is a way that you can submit those. If you hit the Q&A button on the video player, there's a way that you can type in your question, and we will see those, and we'll try to address those. So feel free to do that. The first thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is how to define even just the word technique. When we talk about technique, what exactly are we talking about? And I think very often we think of technique, what comes to mind are like scales and arpeggios, Hannon, Czerny, all that kind of thing. But technique is more than just sort of finger exercises and movements. So I'm kind of curious what your definition of technique would be, or how do you, especially with communicating it to a beginner student, what kind of language would you use to talk about technique and how important it is, or things like that? Julie, would you mind starting us on that one?
Sure. When I'm thinking about beginners, of course, they're not even getting to scales or anything like that for a long time. In Piano Safari, we do 7 basic animal techniques that are tied to an animal. And I have stuffed animals, but I didn't bring them. I should have brought them home with me. Just for the basic motions that all beginners need, which starts with the arm drop, which we call the lion paw, the heavy arm, just playing in the piano. They love to just like bang on the piano with their whole arms. And I've had, even college students who have a hard time finding they never found their arm weight. So if you can do that right at the beginning, that's really helpful. And then teaching them the different articulations, starting with non-legato and then going to legato, and some rotation and repeated notes to strengthen their finger joints. So that's my basic beginning syllabus for the beginners for technique, those basic motions.
That's great. So basic movements of the piano that need to be used, and I think a lot of that has to do with healthy technique, right?
Right.
Of sort of musician wellness and developing those good habits from the beginning.
And also starting with the large muscles and the large limbs, and moving to the fingers later.
That's really good.
They have to get their arm first before they can get their fingers.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. Alyson, how do you talk about technique with your beginner students?
So I think technique is one of those words that the kids have never heard, so it's kind of up to you to define it, which puts a lot of weight on us, but I think we can also make it a little more fun. So I kind of talk about technique is how we physically play the piano. So there are many different ways that we can physically play the piano. Let's figure out which ones are going to be best for our bodies. And so I tend to be a little bit silly with the children. So like I'll turn around at the piano and have my hands behind me. You know, is this how we play the piano? No, that's not how we play the piano. So just when we start off at that very beginning, making sure that they know where your arms are supposed to be, all of that is actually my early technique. And then we get into the same things that Julie was discussing. But I like to just sort of make it a little bit goofy because they know more of technique than they are really aware of. So we talk about technique, how it relates to like basketball or baseball, any of that stuff. Like how do you kick a soccer ball? And they really understand the technical side of that, which then translates usually pretty well to piano.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Edna, what do you have as far as this goes? Like the first idea of letting a beginner student know about technique?
I don't have a lot to add to what you ladies have already shared. This is so wonderful. In fact, I have to look in the piano safari method. That's one of the things I've learned is that even after teaching this many years, there's always something new, another thing that you could adapt or adopt that would make your teaching even more successful. But one of the things that I do like to explain to the children is that the piano is just I show them how the piano works. We look inside the piano and then I point out that it's this big, beautiful piece of furniture that's got all of these pieces in it, all of these screws and wires and wood and so on, and it could just sit there in your living room and look really pretty unless someone is playing it, and you become part of, you are part of the instrument as soon as you put your fingers on. And I like I talk to them about, when they're finished with the song, not to immediately drop their hands. I want them to let that music keep carrying through the air, and I've had them experiment with just finish playing your song, drop your hands to your lap and see what happens, and then finish your song and let your fingers just kind of hover over the keys and then start to fly up like birds lifting off the keys and then land your hands in your lap. That's one of the things, is just to help them see how they are part of the instrument.
I like that. I think that's a good way to put it. I totally agree that lifting out at the end of the piece is something, all of these things that we're talking about are habits that we need to try to get going from the very beginning with students, and because that's what really sets them up for success, if they're starting with the right kind of movements, because otherwise we end up correcting things later. There's a really great quote when I was kind of looking at definitions for technique. I think one of my favorites that I found is by Seymour Fink. He said, "I define it as purposeful movement for musical ends." And I thought that was such a good way to say it, because technique is about all of our muscles and what's going on with our body and movements and things like that, but it's all for musical ends. So it's about trying to get really beautiful sounds out of the piano too. One other quote that I found was by Busoni. "Technique in the truer sense has its seat in the brain." And I really like that because it shows that, again, technique isn't just about movements and muscles and things, but a lot of it is about your brain and how you're thinking about kind of the control that you'll need for your body. So anyway, I thought I would share those. So hopefully with our students we can communicate these things to them, that technique isn't just about movements and kind of making the right motions with our body and sitting a certain way, although that's definitely all part of it. It's more than that. It's about being able to express through our instrument and play in a way that's healthy for your whole life, that will last you. So the next question I wanted to explore a little bit is just kind of talking a little bit about the larger body types of things, like Julie was talking about. So how to sit at the piano. So this is like bench height, sitting tall with a straight, comfortable back, the footstool for the feet, all that sort of thing. Julie, would you mind just giving us like a rundown of what you talk about with these basic piano posture things?
I actually don't talk about that for a few weeks because usually, especially 6- and 7-year-olds, and sometimes 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds are exactly the right height to stand at the piano. So for the first few lessons, I usually just have them stand because they're exactly the right height, and sitting sometimes isn't nearly as comfortable for them as standing. But like this group class I just finished, I had a 4- and 5-year-old class, and 2 of these 4-year-olds were way too short to stand at the piano. It was amazing. I had to prop them up on the bench so high with the highest foot pedal extender ever, and for them to be high enough. So that was kind of strange to have beginners that weren't at the right height. But once I do, and then I do have them sit. Another reason I have them stand is because a lot of the pieces that I teach by rote go all over the piano. And so they're usually too small to just sit and reach the bottom and the top. But once they do have pieces where they're sitting to play, I explain to the parent, you can't have pillows. They need to sit on books or something solid because pillows are too squishy. I show them the right height with the arm level with the keys, make sure they have a footstool. Or for my beginners, I try to make all of them actually go buy a pedal extender because they'll usually need the pedal extender for 3 or 4 years until they can reach the floor, and then they can sell it to another family if they want to, or hand it down to their siblings. So I think it's really worth the investment, especially since a lot of pieces that I do have pedal at the beginning, so they are using the pedal a lot. But if they don't, then footstool definitely necessary. And then I'll have the parents take a side view picture of the child at home at their piano and text it to me, so I can adjust them, say, oh, put one more book under there 2 inches too low or whatever, to make sure that they're sitting properly at home too.
That's a great idea. Maybe I need to do that.
Yeah, sometimes they'll send me a picture and the child's slouching or their shoulders are up, so I'll have to make sure that they're sitting with proper posture. Send me another picture, and
That's a really good idea. I love that. I'd love to have a peek at home at what the setup is.
Right. Yeah, it's really enlightening.
Yeah.
See what their piano is and what the room it's in, and
That's great. Alyson, have you encountered the whole issue of having either the footstool or the pedal extender and bench height? What's your experience with getting families to have a proper setup at home?
It's been difficult. I have a lot of very young ones as well, and so I think when they come to me, they think, oh, my child's only 4 or 5. This isn't, quite a serious thing yet. We're just seeing if they're interested in it. So the investment part is difficult on their end. So they're not sure if they want to invest in a piano, so usually there's a keyboard, which is fine. I give them the criteria for the keyboard, but then when they realize the keyboard can't just sit on the floor, and the kids can play on their belly and play it, it's not quite the same. So I love the idea of having them text me a picture. I've never done that. But I discuss, how to sit. One thing that I really love is in Faber's My First Piano Adventure series. In Book A, they go through, the first few pages are about how to sit at the piano. And the kids love it. They make their fists and they put them straight out and make sure that it's touching the fall board. So they learn what a fall board is immediately, which I love. And I've got a baby grand, so it falls down, so we very dramatically watch it fall down. So they go home to their house and see where they can put their arms stretched out to and see if they're at the right distance. So that's been very helpful. The other thing they just love to do is I always have the parents bring a small stuffed animal with them for that first lesson. And when we get them all sitting up perfectly, then it rests on their head. And we try to play a little song or something with it being kept on their head. And that's one thing that I know for sure that they actually do at home. So even though I'm not sure if they're working on their posture as much as I'd like to, I'm going to totally implement having them text me a picture. But I know that they're having the little thing on their head, so that they're working to try to sit up tall and play their songs. And I mean, some of these kids get brave, and there are giant stuffed animals. I've gotten pictures of that before. So yeah, I think the biggest issue is trying to explain to the parents that this is part of piano lessons, that we really do need a footstool. We really do need some books for them to sit on.
Oh, one more thing I wanted to add. After the first few lessons, I just want them to enjoy it, feel good, and play a few songs. So that's when they're standing a lot. But then I make it kind of a big deal. The second or third lesson, it's like, now you get to sit at the piano. And then we go through the whole thing of how they sit. And then for a while, I got kind of lazy about when they'd come in, like adjusting for each student. But I realized that's so important at the beginning of the lesson to make sure it's like check everything. And I have carpet squares covered in pillowcases that are different heights and different colors. Like this one I'm sitting on right now is blue. So they all know like how many cushions they are or what color their cushion is. And then I take the time to adjust the pedal extender exactly so that it's like a ritual at the beginning of the lesson, which I'm hoping will carry over at home too. And now they're growing, you know, like some of them have grown like 2 inches over the summer, so it's like good to adjust for each student.
That is really good, and I totally agree that, you know, as teachers we have to take the time to do it at the beginning of the lesson if there's ever a chance that students are going to learn to do it on their own.
Yeah. And at Heart there's a big Suzuki program, and the parents actually bring their own wooden footstools that they got and their own cushion with them to lessons. So it's like a big deal. You see all these parents walking around with footstools.
Yeah, but they feel like they're in a club, right?
Right.
Edna, I bet with your experience with teaching over Skype and FaceTime, that's sort of like having, I mean, you do have a picture of what the student's setup at home is like. Do you find that that's kind of helpful in that way?
I don't know that it's any more helpful than what you ladies have already been talking about, because I'm not there when they're practicing.
That's true.
It's the same thing that you said. I can correct them just as though they were here in my room if their posture is not correct. But yeah, it's the commitment that the parents are making to it. Some of the parents are really good at watching and making sure that they want to know. You know, you can tell the parents everything. That is one nice thing about when I email or do the OneNotes with the students. The parents are seeing everything. I know they're seeing it. When I'm teaching in my home, they all have binders, and I write in there what they are supposed to be doing. But I know often, or I mean most of the time, the parents never look inside. And so I try to take advantage when the parents pick up the students to talk to them and remind them about the things that they need to be watching for and listening for. But one thing I do with those binders, that on their first lesson, or sometime towards the beginning, I take a picture of them sitting at the piano, having their hands on the keys and looking up at the book and pretending like they're playing something. I take a picture of that and we put it on the front of their binder. And that way we can use that to say, now, are you always sitting like this? But I tell them that it's so that they've got a record of when they first started taking piano lessons, but something that could be used to say, remember, this is how you're supposed to be sitting when you're at the piano. Right? One idea. But I'm sitting here scribbling notes as you guys were talking.
I've also noticed lately, like I have a pretty good feed because I have so many young ones about how many carpet squares or how high the pedal extender should be for like your given 7-year-old. But I've noticed there's a lot of variation in their torso height. So I have one 7-year-old who takes like 1 carpet square when another exactly the same height 7-year-old will take 3, you know, because their torsos are so different in height. Or siblings that are 2 years apart that take exactly the same number because they're just different on the top.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you can't just assume that you know you have to check the height all the time.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a really great website that I wanted to kind of mention here. It has a lot of pictures of students and showing how the proper height affects their playing and how having the proper footstool affects everything. Anyway, if you visit thewellbalancedpianist.com, and then on the left-hand side there's a menu, and if you click where it says proper seating, this is a really wonderful website. I've gone back to this website quite a few times and just studied the pictures because I've just been so amazed at how you can see from these pictures what a difference it makes to take the time to establish the right bench height and the footstool and that sort of thing. For anyone interested, you can check that out.
Thank you.
The next question I wanted to kind of look at, I guess with young beginners, I think getting proper technique takes a lot of work and time, and sometimes for students it might be frustrating. Do you find, I'm just curious, do you have certain goals that you shoot for first, and then over time you kind of try to get some of the other things, or do you, is that question clear? What I'm trying to get at? Julie or Alyson, do you have something?
Well, I was just going to say that I start right away. We talk about getting ice cream hands, and we having a big scoop of ice cream that we grab, and then as they turn it over and put that hand down on the piano, I always say, don't make a mess on my piano, don't drop ice cream all over it. And so it helps them kind of keep that hand nice and round. That I encourage from pretty much day one. We talk about ice cream hands. If you talk about ice cream, a 5-year-old will talk your head off about their favorite ice cream. So it gets them to open up really quickly. That I encourage first. And then I feel like everything else sort of somewhat kind of makes its way in slowly. But you're right. I think if we try to incorporate all the technique within the first, month of lessons, it gets really overwhelming. So every week I give them something specific to be thinking about. So whether it's ice cream hands or whether it's in my first piano adventure, we do the cat back ones where they're learning to kind of rise a little bit. And I always say, now do this in the car on your way home, and do it when you're on your way to dance lessons. And so I give them a lot of technique homework to do in the car, not just at the piano. And so the brothers and sisters are all doing it with them, and I find that tends to reinforce it a little bit better than make sure you're doing it when you're just playing the piano.
That's great. Julie, what do you have to say about this? Are there certain things that you try to get first, or what's your opinion?
I go at it sort of the opposite way, but I think it all ends up in the same spot eventually, but it's definitely a process. Like last year when I started at Hart, I had about 15 beginners and 15 transfer students, and so it was like a mess for a while because all my beginners would go the same way in terms of their technical growth. They go through spurts and phases. And so at one point they were all looking pretty bad, all at the same time because I'd started them all at the same time. And then eventually they come out of it and start looking really good. But the way I start with the whole arm, so they're playing basically with finger 2 for their first several songs just to get their arm going. And then they can play all over the piano by rote, so they don't need to know like the names of the black keys or white keys or anything. It's just all by pattern. And then when we start on the black keys with reading, just with finger numbers pre-staff, black keys are harder to play on than white keys. It's really hard to have a good hand shape when you're playing on the black keys. But at that point, I find that they really still have a hard time having a good hand shape anyway. So they're still finding their fingers. Like some of the littler ones, like you say, can you play finger 2? And they're like, okay, like 1, 2, 2. It's like they can barely find their fingers. So I let them go through that phase of finding that, oh, I have fingers and they're attached to my arm and I can play these different fingers. And I'm not too concerned about the rounded hand shape when they're on the black keys. I try to encourage it for the ones that are a little more physically able. But then when they get to the white keys in the next unit, still pre-staff playing with finger numbers, suddenly it's easier to play on the white keys. So suddenly their hand shape starts to come in. They have more control so that we can work more on that. And then I start really going after the finger joints and the rounded fingers. I hardly ever say curved fingers because then they tend to get too tight or too curved or cave in their bridge. But I've started saying it a little bit more lately just to experiment to see, is that really going to happen, or are they going to have a nice hand shape? Another thing I do is I have these little, I should have brought one, pom-poms with eyes on them called fuzzies. They'll do anything for the fuzzy. And so this is a fuzzy house, and he goes in his little door under the thumb so that the bridge is not collapsed, but it's up. So the fuzzy sits under there on the keys, and we check the hand shape, and then I press on their knuckles to see if they're strong or if their fuzzy house is going to fall down. If their bridge falls down, they're going to squish their fuzzy and kill him. It's like really sad. So, you want to be nice to the fuzzy and keep your hand up. So we go back to that over and over again, even before they start playing with an open hand. We're talking about the fuzzy house. And so then they have their arm going, and then we add the fingers, and then gradually form the hand shape. But it takes a long time, and it's not perfect. For a while. It's a formation of the hand, which takes a long time. And I have 2 little girls in the class I just had in group class. Like one child can't even make her hand like this at all. Like she's so completely double jointed, and it's like, oh dear. So I've been wondering, like, maybe I should get her a squishy ball to strengthen her hand. I don't know what to do about that yet.
Every student is a challenge.
Yes. But double jointed kids can fix those knuckles. I've had some do it lately. Like one little 5-year-old, she was 4 at the time, and her dad somehow got her to fix them at home without me, so that was helpful, but I was a little worried when I first found them because that's, difficult.
That's a challenge.
So I guess I go from the whole arm to gradually forming the hand and then being extremely picky all the time, not letting things slide, but you have to balance it with enjoyment.
Yeah, that's a challenge. That's really great. I love hearing how creative you guys all are. I think teachers are creative anyway, but the fuzzies and ice cream scoops. This is great stuff. Julie, you hit on something that a couple people just submitted questions about. 2 people just mentioned, well, they asked, how do you deal with students who are overly tense in their hands and in their fingers? One of them here says, when the student plays with one finger, all the other fingers are pointing up and out like a big claw. So
I think a lot of it has to do with control. Like they feel out of control, and so they tense up. So that's why it's really important to start with the big motions in the arm, and then they might be a little tight for a while at the beginning, and then as they gain more control, they can learn how to hold their hand without the extra tension. But probably about the 4th step in, I start working with the thumb. Like sometimes their thumb will be sticking up, and so I'll just say, if they're not playing a note, I'll say, okay, freeze on finger 2, and then I'll just like say, drop your thumb, and then I'll wiggle it to see if it's relaxed. Okay, keep going. Freeze. Okay, let's drop this and drop this. Drop the thumb. Because if their thumb is relaxed, then the rest of the hand will be relaxed. But they have to learn how to feel what a relaxed thumb feels like, because that's kind of a tricky skill. But usually it takes, a couple weeks to a month to fix that, and then they'll have that feeling of the relaxed thumb.
I've done a really similar thing too, where we call it the freeze dance. So like when they're playing their songs, when one of the fingers is stopping up, we'll yell freeze, and then they have to fix it, and then they go right back into it. So it's almost like a freeze dance for their fingers. It's kind of the same thing, but it makes it a little bit more fun, and that makes sure that I'm being a little stricter as well, and I make sure to repeat, and make sure they're learning what they need to, because sometimes I feel like if I just repeat it over and over that it's going to go in one ear and out the other. So that's one thing that's very similar that we do.
But it's not the same. Having a good hand shape is not the same as I think there's still that myth out there from the 18th century that all your fingers have to be touching the keys, but that's not the way you really play. I mean, your fingers do fly up as you're playing, and that's good because they're relaxed. They're not glued to the keys and you're just hardly moving them. So, but it's like the extreme sticking up that's tight that you want to correct.
When they're so tense, that's the problem. They always tense them up.
Right. Or curving too much or being curl, like the curly pinky. I call that the hermit crab finger. Let's get rid of that hermit crab. And again, to fix that, it just takes, okay, stop, get rid of your hermit crab, keep going. And then it'll do it again. Stop, get rid of your hermit crab, okay, keep going. And after a while, it will stay relaxed. But if you can avoid that habit altogether, then that's better than trying to fix it later.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it all comes from having the arm behind the finger, because then the arm is controlling the fingers rather than the fingers feeling like they have to control themselves and getting tight.
I totally agree. One thing that I learned compared to when I first started teaching was just that whole idea of how important the bench height is. I mean, I knew it was proper, but like when I really started to see it, what difference it made in my students, then that just reinforced it all the more. But that has made a difference in the fingers too. If students are sitting too low, there's just no way that they can figure out how to make this proper shape and hold their fingers. And
especially because then they're playing like this from below rather than dropping in from above. I use the pencil of doom and just stick it under their hand, and if they go down, like if they're going down too low, they'll stab themselves. They like that.
Yeah, that is one of the advantages to my Skype lessons, is that they are sitting at their own pianos. So I can make sure that they've got the benches at the right height, so that when they are practicing, they are at the right height, and make sure they've got their footstools under their feet, and so that is one advantage. I'm in their home.
One thing that John Weems told me when I was doing my dissertation, if kids fall back like this, it's often because their elbow is falling back. So if you just push their elbow forward a little, because really when we play, we do a little forward motion on the note rather than pulling back and down. So that's kind of helpful too.
Yeah, I like
with
that.
The pencil of doom.
Yeah, combined techniques.
Yeah.
I like that idea of what you just said, the elbow going forward.
Right.
Part of that too is the elbow being out from the body, because so often students tuck in like that with their elbows, and that just sets everything wrong, from arm on in.
I feel like they tend to do that if they're constrained in the middle of the piano, like a middle C position or something where they're not moving around the keyboard a lot. I haven't had a lot of kids doing that when I have them play a lot of pieces all over the keyboard using their arms. So that's been a change in my teaching.
Yeah. So maybe we should, Julie's been talking a little bit about her piano safari method. Would you mind, and your dissertation, Julie, so would you mind talking to us a little bit about what your dissertation was about, and then tell us more about piano safari and where to find it?
My dissertation was about beginning technique. I wanted it to be practical, and so I've actually had a few people write me and say they ordered it and read it. It's very long, so I would not suggest reading it. But what I did is I observed 4 teachers around the country about what they did, how they teach technique to beginners, and then after my dissertation was finished, I observed about 8 other teachers, really well-known teachers like John Weems and Marvin Blickenstaff and Carolyn Schock. Lots of teachers around the country. Totally changed my teaching forever. Not just about technique, but about other things. And from that, derived the basic commonalities from all the teachers, regardless of their background. Some were Taubman teachers, and some were Russian teachers. And Suzuki, Mary Craig Powell, Suzuki teacher in Columbus, was part of my dissertation. And boiled it all down to the commonalities. Common motions to all these teachers, and gave them animal names because that's more fun. And so that's where we got the animal techniques, just the basic motions for beginners with the arm drop and the rotation, different articulations, repeated notes, which really help firm up those finger joints so they're not all collapsed. And then in level 2, Piano Safari, we go into 5-finger patterns and triads and special keyboard choreography exercises and different patterns that they'll need to know to play early intermediate rep.
That's great.
To your question.
And you should mention the website.
Oh yeah, pianosafari.com, and we have teacher guides and a lot of videos also. So, and we answer emails personally since it's just me and Katie right now. So anyone has any questions, feel free to email us.
Yes, the Piano Safari method came up a couple weeks ago when we were talking about piano methods. So,
oh, really?
Yes, we were talking about it a little bit. This is a great
follow-up. I never actually finished watching it, but
yeah,
I will.
You got to go in there. So this is great. That's part of the reason why I invited Julie to talk today, was because of all her background in technique, and to kind of follow up on Piano Safari. I think that's great.
Growing up, I had no technique, and so that's why I wanted to do this dissertation, because I didn't actually feel like I had technique that worked for me until doctoral school. Like, I felt very insecure about my technique all the way through because I hadn't had that foundation when I was young. So I wanted to make sure I wasn't messing up my students or whatever, because a lot of method books, they're like, here, play fingers 2, 3, 4, but they don't tell you how, like how your hand should look, whether it should be legato or non-legato, coming from the finger or the arm, all those basic questions that are not rocket science, but need to be verbalized so that we all know, yes, the arm first, then the fingers. Yes, you have to have a good hand shape from basically the beginning. You can't wait until the 3rd year to try to build a technique. So all those basic things are what I was going for with my dissertation.
That's great. Yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about your background with technique. Kind of like you, Julie, I don't remember my teacher talking a lot about technique as a beginner, and maybe I don't remember that much. But you know, I think I was fairly lucky that I have always had a fairly relaxed technique. I never had to deal with too much tension, but technique wasn't really ever specifically addressed until I got to more college level study. So I think that's so interesting, but it seems so wrong at the same time. It's like,
by the time I got to college, my teachers expected I already had technique. And so they didn't really know how to fix those basic things that I really needed to fix. I had one teacher for one semester that totally redid my technique, thank goodness.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Edna, what's your background? What do you remember as a child taking piano lessons? Do you remember your teacher?
I'm the same way. Yeah, as I think back to my very beginning so many years ago. I'm obviously the very oldest one here in this group. I don't remember being taught technique at all either.
How about you, Alyson?
I remember a lot of my technique. I did traditional Suzuki piano, so I and I just remember it being a little bit tedious because you try to do a lot of the repeated notes. I remember, if my fingers weren't quite perfect, if my wrist was off, we would just do it again and again and again, and just to make sure that it was correct. And I think that really did help me. But then again, I also don't look back and think like, boy, my piano lessons were so much fun. I really looked forward to them every week. It was a little bit more of a chore.
And that's the thing, like you can have good technique and teach good technique and make it fun at the same time. It just takes a little bit more thought. Like, ooh, perhaps I should get a stuffed zebra. That will help. Or a fuzzy.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be tedious.
Yeah.
It's not good technique or fun. It can be both.
And I remember one thing that's so funny is my piano teacher when I was young had a ruler, and she would always kind of like lightly tap our wrists with the ruler if our wrists weren't quite behaving properly.
Wow.
And I was helping an older student. I think he was like in 6th grade or so, and I was helping him with his wrist because he was really having trouble getting the right wrist action. And so I told him that story in a very lighthearted, jokey way, and he just looked up with me with these big eyes and was like, "You ever tell your mommy that?"
Oh.
So it makes me realize that can't really happen anymore.
No, definitely not.
So funny now.
Yeah. It's interesting to look back and think about that, and I don't know. We all learn from our experience, and then we learn a lot more, I think, as teachers from conferences and books and talking with other teachers like we are now and things like that. I think that's so important that we don't just teach how we're taught, but we're always looking for more, always looking for new ideas and ways to improve. That's great.
I never had any training in the wrist at all for a long time. And so I was always curious about that with my kids. And I've come to the conclusion that I never say anything about the wrist for almost a year, because instead I work on the bridge. The bridge is so important, and then the wrist usually follows. So if I can get their hand shape looking good, then they're not going to do anything weird with their wrist. Because little kids can't really feel the difference between their bridge or their wrist. So if you're like, can you put your bridge up? They'll like put their elbow up, They don't have the different body parts. So I mean, I know my co-author Katie is a little different. She does a little bit more wrist work from the beginning, or from a little earlier than I do. But I found that the less I say about the wrist in the first year, the less awkward looking they'll get sometimes. Just depends on the kid too, like how aware they are of their body. But that bridge is so important, being up and not collapsed.
Yeah.
And I find that the wrist issue a lot of times is how they're sitting too. I feel like that's like the #1 thing that gets negatively impacted when they're not practicing correctly at home. And that's kind of my insight. When they come to me and are playing like this, that's when I need to say, how are we sitting at home? What's going on?
They're probably too low.
Yeah.
Overcompensating. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's great. Let's see. Maybe next, we sort of hit on this already. We've been hitting on so many good different things here, which is great. But the whole idea of the 5-finger pattern, it's used a lot in different piano methods today, and I kind of see the advantage of it. It has to do with being able to, like multi-key piano methods, you can kind of go from different positions and stuff. So I see the advantage of teaching 5-finger patterns, but it can, I think, sometimes negatively affect their technique to try to have, a small child's hand, 5 fingers, trying to spread out over 5 piano keys is not natural for them, and it's difficult to hold. And if we even just calling it a 5-finger position, makes them think that that's what they need, though. They end up with that claw, kind of like we were talking about earlier, that tension. So I'll ask Julie, I guess, because I think you were the one who was talking about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we don't get to 5-finger patterns until book 2, because we do all these other motions, the animal ones.
That's on purpose, right?
On purpose, yes. Because you're right, their hands are, like a 4-year-old's hands over a 5-finger pattern would be like us spread out over an octave. That's how it would feel for them. And then some of the parents have had a little piano in their background, you know. So when it gets to 5-finger patterns, I have to explain to some of the parents, I do not want your child to have their fingers over these 5 consecutive keys. And it should be dropping on each one, and the arm moves behind the finger that's playing. So they're never spread out, and they're never glued to the keys. And that's why in Book 2, our first 5-finger pattern exercise is repeated notes. It's kangaroo, so kangaroo, kangaroo, kangaroo. So they're playing multiple notes on one finger before they go to the next one, so that they can really feel that bouncy arm and then be centered over the finger that's playing. Because the consecutive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is really hard, and that comes later. And also, when they do that, we do what we call the tree frog technique, which is a legato with an arm bounce for each note. So their arm is still behind the finger that's playing. So it's never the fingers doing things by themselves like that, like a spider. No spider technique anywhere. So yeah, and I find that the 5-finger patterns are more helpful for theoretical things rather than technical things. So because they do need to know the different key shapes, and it does help them to say, hey, this piece is in D position, because then they know where to put their hands. And but just have to be careful about the way they play the 5-finger pattern, so that it's not just the fingers, but it's the arm moving from finger to finger, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's been my experience as well, especially with the 4th and the 5th fingers, which, you know, we could consider them the weaker fingers. And but if a student's trying to hold this 5-finger position and then they try to play with their pinky, it's no wonder that we see students who just, their wrist falls and their finger falls flat, everything falls.
Right.
You know, it's because they're not keeping their arm behind that finger.
Right, so, and it does take me some time to convince, like I'll have parents, really zealous piano parents who I love, go home and say, no, you must have your fingers on the keys while you're playing this. And I have to go back again and say, no, they should be moving with the arm.
Right.
You shouldn't be stuck, because that's the way they think it should be. I also have to convince some parents that no, I do not want them to play legato for the first 5 months or so. You must be bouncy on everything, because some parents will try to push their child to play legato too soon, and they end up really tight playing with just their fingers instead of with the arm. So had to backtrack with parents a little bit on that.
Right, yeah. This has been so interesting. We're getting close to the end of our time here today, but I love hearing how different everyone's approaches are to the same thing. You know, we're all trying to achieve the same thing with our students, with the technique. But I think that technique is something that's not talked about enough, and maybe it's because it's kind of controversial.
Well, I think we're all heading for the same direction, but there are different ways of getting there, too.
Right.
So, and every teacher has to find the way that works, you know, with the different analogies or different exercises.
Totally true. Yeah. So I think that's all the more reason why a conversation like this is so valuable, because it really makes us think about the way we do things, you know, and get us some new ideas. Let's see. I saw a question just get added here. It looks like a quick question. How do you encourage students not to pause between measures, even though we are counting, keeping their eyes on the music, slow speed, etc.? It says, I've tried an invisible string drawing the notes along, but some students are struggling. So this is a little bit off topic from technique, but it's related too. Does anyone want to try to answer that?
One thing that has helped a little bit for me is using, so sometimes the methods books comes with CDs, and you can play the CDs along with it, and that kind of helps them, encourage them to keep going and keep going without the pauses. But one thing that I like to do even more than that is I use the app, I think it's called Super Metronome Groove Box, and so it's got just like a basic beat behind it, and it's got a little rock beat behind it, and that, when they know the song well enough to go from measure to measure, and we practice that transition, and they can do it, but they're just sort of pausing because they're kind of rethinking in their brain, okay, now something new is coming on. When they're really ready for that, then I get out the Super Metronome Groove Box app, and we play it behind it, and so that backing track helps them feel that beat and feel that need to keep moving. But I'd love to hear other opinions, because that's definitely a challenge in the studio.
do a ta system. So for the first year or book one, they're just counting with ta, 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 ta-ti, ta-ti, ta-ti for eighth notes, and then ta, two, ta, two. And so if they stop, like if they're in 3/4 and they stop on a bar line, especially in their sight reading cards that they practice, which are just short sight reading exercises, I'll just say, hey, these keep going with tas. Can you do it with tas? And then I'll point and play along and say the tas, and usually that corrects it. Because, I mean, 3/4 is harder to play in than 4/4, so they often do add a ta-tu in the middle to make it 4/4. But just pointing along to help them track, and then sometimes playing or singing the tas. That's how I usually go about fixing that.
Yeah, both of those things that you guys just commented about have the thing in common about kind of bringing students to have the experience of the music and the beat. And the problem, you know, of course, is that students who pause at the measures are seeing a bar line at the measure, and it looks like you should stop there. It just looks like you're seeing the groupings, and they're reflecting that. But I think that's the important thing, is to bring them to the experience one way or another, to experience that steady beat that keeps going, even though it looks like there's a break there. There's not, you know.
Yeah, and I like to make sure that they're looking ahead too, not just focusing on that note that they are playing right now, but be always looking ahead and jumping from measure to measure, and making sure that it's all, they realize how it's all connected. I had a teacher suggest to me one time years ago to take a piece of paper or something and put it up there and push it along so they can't see the note that they're playing at the time they're playing. They have to be looking ahead. If they're going to see that, know what to play, they have to have looked ahead already, and it just forces them to do that. Just keep looking ahead and see how the music keeps going. It doesn't stop at the bar line.
Yeah. Sometimes they might pause also because they're looking up and down a lot instead of just looking up when they're sight reading. So I often say, okay, now this last time you're going to get the challenge, I'm going to cover up your hands with a book. And I put the book over their hands and then track along with them on the page as they play it. And then I'm like, oh, that was the best ever. You can play it without looking at their hands. And then they start asking to have their hands covered up when they're doing their sight reading.
It's amazing how you can turn anything into a game. That's, you know?
Yeah, John Sham has one course. Which course is it? He's got that keynote finder where you have to, it's got a paper drape in the book, you put it over your head, and then it goes under your book, and it's got a picture of the keyboard on it, but the hands are hidden underneath it. So you can still see what the keys look like, but they can't see their hands. And so the keys are right there by the book. I don't know if you can.
That's interesting.
But anyway, I've used that before. I haven't used it for quite a while, but I have used that with some of my students to get them to feel the keys and not keep looking down.
I think it's a revelation to them that they can play without actually seeing their fingers, that they can feel which finger's going down without having to look at it, is kind of a surprise to them, you know. And it's like a big deal. Like, you don't have to look at your fingers and you can still play this. Isn't that amazing?
On top of that, it always sounds better too. And they don't realize
it does.
But it always goes.
They're not looking up and down, so they're reading better, of course. So,
right. That's great. All right, so maybe for our last question for today, let's kind of hint a little bit towards more getting towards the intermediate level. I'm curious, what age or skill level do you introduce scales, and how do you go about doing that? Alyson, would you mind kicking us off on that?
Sure. I probably started off a lot younger than some, but at the very end of the book A of the My First Piano Adventure series, we do a C 5-finger scale with our right hand and our left hand. And once they learn that one, then we do the 5-finger scales for like the children's warm-up. So I do that one, and that does take a little while, but we start to introduce that. And again, it's the same thing that Julie was talking about. I don't expect them to leave their hands in that position. It's playing those notes and dropping our arm onto it. And so we learn all of the 5-finger scales first. And then when they've accomplished that, they can do right and left and put them together. Then I introduce we're probably like looking at book 1, end of book 1, beginning of book 2, when we start to do 2-octave scales. I haven't found any perfect progression. I think it really depends on the student. I've had some students that probably their second lesson could play a 2-octave scale no problem, and some that really struggle with it. So I try to take into account kind of where the student is. I'd love to be able to have more of a guideline of when exactly to introduce them. But for right now, the 5-finger scales comes at the end of that first book A, and then everything else sort of comes when I can tell that they're ready for it.
That's like pretty much exactly what I do too. It's totally gauged on what the student is ready for.
Yeah.
Julie, when do you teach scales?
Well, in Piano Safari Book 2, we don't have any scales. We have scale preparation. So they have what we call the scale snake exercise, which is one of the special exercises that go of 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, all the way up and down. And then they have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the scale preparation. And they also have chord progression preparation in that book. And then in Book 3, which we haven't written yet, but we're working on, they start scales. And Katie and I have totally revamped the way we've done it, because both of us have taught scales a lot of different ways in the past, but her son Isaiah is studying with Mary Craig Powell Suzuki right now, and she stays on C major hand separately for a very long time, working it up with the metronome to gain speed and evenness and clarity in the tone before moving on to any other scales. And so I think that's really beneficial, and I'm trying that right now, especially with some of my transfer students who supposedly knew all their scales, but so I feel like this year I sort of pushed them to review all those scales, but it was kind of a nightmare with fingerings and them not really knowing the fingerings, even though they supposedly have been playing these scales for years and years. So I think I'm going to go the slow and steady route from now on with all my students, even the transfer students, to make sure they really have the basics of playing a scale with good technique, with your fingers all working correctly and with the tone being even, and slowly, gradually speeding it up. Even if it seems easy for them, it's better to start slow and progress rather than give them too many scales and then they get all the fingerings messed up and then it doesn't sound good. And so I think slow and steady wins the race for scales.
Yeah, and I feel like slow and steady is so important, and it's really hard to convince the kids too that like just because they can almost play hands together okay 1 week doesn't mean they're finished with it. I think a lot of them expect to do 1 scale per week and be done with it. And I think it's really important to really work on the technique with the scales there. So I tend to spend quite a few weeks on each scale as well. And I
have a lot of, oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say I think it's frustrating for the children, but I think it's really necessary.
Well, I have a lot of charts too, and so even if we're moving really slowly, they might be moving fast on their chart. Like, oh, this week you do it at 92 and 94 and 96. Wow, you blocked off 3 whole things on your chart.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then after they finish a chart, they go into another chart, and there's a never-ending progression of charts that all are for different things. So they feel like they're making progress, even if we're working really slowly on a certain thing with their technique.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Edna, can I turn it to you? What do you do with your scales?
Well, when I also do it when I feel they're ready, but I do start the pentascales when we get to the point where they know the 5 notes. And then I have them play them all over the piano and so on. You already all know all about that. I just wanted to throw in one tip that I figured out years ago that was a fun way to introduce the scales to children. I have handbells, and I have them play the handbells, and we talk about how many notes there are in that scale.
Oh, that's fun.
There, and then I have them go back to the piano, and I have them play the scale again, and whatever fingers they want to use for it. And then I talk about how many notes there are and how many fingers they have, and do they have enough fingers to play all 8 of those notes. You know, and we do the math, figure it out. And my son took piano lessons from a jazz pianist years ago, and I always tell this little story about how he taught my son how to let the thumb do the work, to shift the hand when they're doing the.
Oops.
Sorry, my daughter's calling me. I think she's sitting outside wanting me to go get my granddaughter. We're just about wrapped up, so.
Yes.
Anyway, those are 2 things that I use when I'm teaching the scales to them. Adult students, it's a totally different thing with them. I do a lot of adult beginners, and I can just teach them differently than I teach the children.
Sure, yeah. That we could talk all day long about technique, I think. We really could. But that's our time for today is up. So I want to thank each of you for being willing to be in the video chat today and have this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely learned some new things that I'm going to try. Thanks to those who are watching from YouTube. We will probably be doing another one of these next week. If you are interested in the details about that, you can look up Color in My Piano on Facebook, and that's where I've been posting about the next event. So thanks again for watching and participating, and happy teaching.
Okay, thank you, Joy. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.